You see the interview last night? Oprah returned with Meghan and Harry in what will surely go down in history as the most shocking gender reveal party of all time.
What detonated on late-night television last night wasn't playful satire or harmless ribbing. It felt like, and Meghan Markle suddenly became the center of a monologue blitz that few saw coming. One host went first, then another doubled down, then a third pushed it even further, all live, all with a sharpness that didn't feel rehearsed, but absolutely felt intentional. Viewers say you could feel the temperature change through the screen. This wasn't the usual wink and nod celebrity teasing. The jokes escalated into pointed critiques, and punchlines landed with the weight of commentary rather than comedy. The audience reaction was loud, electric, and a little uneasy, the kind of laughter that sounds less like fun and more like permission. Within minutes, clips were ripped from broadcasts and hurled across social media. Timelines lit up, group chats exploded, and suddenly the question wasn't why they joked. It was why now. According to people watching closely, Meghan's camp wasn't expecting this. Not like this. Not this coordinated. Not this confident. Friends reportedly reached out. Advisors allegedly went into emergency mode. Because this wasn't one bad joke you shrug off. It felt like a narrative shift happening live, in front of millions, with no opportunity to respond in real time. What made it unsettling was the tone, not angry, not cruel, certain. As if the hosts sensed the cultural tide had turned and chose to surf it, rather than resist it. And once late-night comedy smells that shift, it rarely backs off. Insiders whisper that it didn't feel spontaneous. It felt greenlit. If that's true, last night wasn't the peak. It was the warning shot. The first joke didn't sound nuclear. That's what made it dangerous. It opened with familiar territory. Celebrity branding, public reinvention, media fatigue, polite laughter, safe ground. Then the cadence slowed, the smile tightened, and the jokes stopped floating. They were aimed. You could hear the pause, the half-second where the room realized something sharper was coming, and then the laughter grew louder anyway. Not because it was funnier, but because it felt like crossing a line together. Then came the second wave. Another show, another host. Same night, different network, same target. That's when coincidence started to look like a pattern. The tone didn't soften, it escalated. References were obvious even without names, endless reinvention, looping narratives, telling your story so many times the audience starts finishing the sentences for you. By the end of the night, the gloves weren't just off, they were on the floor. And whether this was comedy catching up to public fatigue or something more deliberate, one thing was clear. Late night didn't just joke about Meghan Markle last night, it signaled something. And then, like chaos had perfect timing, a third late-night moment hit. Shorter, sharper, and somehow even more lethal. One joke, one line. No warm-up, no build-up. Just a clean shot that landed. And the show moved on like nothing happened. The audience laughed, then froze, then laughed again, louder. According to people close to Meghan, that was the moment everything tipped. Not a breakdown, not tears on camera, but emotional whiplash. Phones lighting up non-stop, advisors scrambling, group chats blowing up, emergency calls flying back and forth, not because the joke crossed some legal line, but because it hit too close. That's the nightmare scenario for any public figure. When satire doesn't exaggerate, it matches what the audience already feels. What made it even more unsettling was the reaction in the room. No groans, no awkward coughs, no too-far energy, just smooth, easy laughter. That kind of response doesn't happen by accident. When late-night audiences laugh without hesitation, it signals something deeper than humor. It signals cultural exhaustion. Almost instantly, fans split into camps. Supporters cried misogyny, cruelty, opportunism. Critics fired back that comedy was finally catching up to public sentiment. But neutral observers noticed something colder. This didn't feel like a hit job. It felt like hosts reading the room and deciding it was finally safe to say the quiet part out loud. Insiders say Meghan's team knew right away this couldn't be spun with a statement. There was nothing to correct, no misquote, no false claim. Comedy doesn't care about fact checks. It runs on vibes, and the vibe had turned solid and sharp. What the jokes tapped into wasn't scandal, it was fatigue. Fatigue with recycled narratives, fatigue with framing, fatigue with being told how to react. Old interviews resurfaced within hours. Not to defend her, but to underline the jokes. Clips about finding her voice, paired next to punchlines about never leaving the mic alone. Quotes about boundaries stacked beside jokes about nonstop visibility. The contrast wasn't created last night. It had been sitting there for years. Late night just put a spotlight on it. What made this night different from past criticism was the lack of caution. No hedging, no soft landings, no nervous self-awareness. The delivery was calm, confident, almost relieved, like someone finally cracked open a window in a room that had been stale for a long time. And once that window opens, the air rushes out fast. By the time the final clip went viral, the conversation had already slipped out of control. It wasn't about whether the jokes were fair anymore. It was about why they landed so cleanly, why the laughter sounded unanimous, and why multiple hosts across different platforms all felt comfortable going there on the same night. In Hollywood, trends don't just happen. They happen when people sense safety, when the audience is ready, when the risk feels low and the reward feels high. And if that's true, then last night wasn't random. It was a signal. Because once someone becomes a punchline without pushback, the real fallout doesn't come from the jokes. It comes from what those jokes give everyone else permission to say next. These weren't edgy risks. They were safe bets. And that's the nightmare scenario in Hollywood. When ridicule becomes safe, the danger isn't cruelty, it's consensus. What unsettled people wasn't that the jokes were harsh, it was that they were predictable. Multiple hosts, different networks, same framing, the same critiques, the same angles, even the same tired cadence, like everyone had been holding their tongue and suddenly agreed it was okay to stop. One industry executive reportedly summed it up perfectly. It feels like the dam broke. And once a dam breaks, no one controls where the water goes. Behind the scenes, Meghan's team allegedly shifted from reaction to triage. This wasn't a moment for clapbacks or statements. You can't correct comedy. You can't litigate laughter. The only real option was to assess how far perception had drifted and whether it could still be pulled back. According to sources, that assessment didn't go well. The internet had already done what it does best: connect dots. Users stitched together late-night jokes with old interviews, podcast clips, speeches, docuseries moments, headlines stretching back years. Not to fact-check, but to validate a feeling. And once people feel validated, they stop questioning. Comment sections filled with the same line over and over. This is what people have been saying privately for years. That sentence is devastating to any carefully managed image because it means the jokes didn't create a new opinion. They surfaced an existing one. And when late-night hosts echo what audiences already think, they aren't shaping opinion, they're confirming it. Defenders pushed back, pointing to misogyny, double standards, and the cruelty of mocking a woman who has spoken openly about trauma. Those arguments weren't wrong, but they struggled to gain traction against something far more slippery: fatigue. The criticism wasn't that Meghan spoke up. It was that many felt they'd heard the same framing too many times. Fair or not, repetition breeds impatience, and impatience breeds punchlines. Media analysts noted another chilling detail. None of the hosts walked anything back. No next night clarifications. No softening. Just silence and continued jokes. In late-night comedy, that silence signals confidence. Confidence that the audience is with you and will stay with you. That's the green light writers wait for. Meanwhile, brand chatter reportedly shifted. Not cancellations, not exits, pauses, meetings. Let's see how this plays out. In Hollywood, let's see is code for uncertainty. And uncertainty freezes momentum faster than outrage ever could. Online discourse hardened. What started as debate turned into labeling. Words like overplayed, calculated, and predictable appeared more often than outright insults. Those words are dangerous because they're about taste, not morality. You can recover from being hated. Recovering from being seen as repetitive or out of sync is far harder. Creators piled in, not to attack directly, but to analyze. Long videos dissected why the jokes landed, why the timing felt right, why late-night comedy, usually cautious around certain figures, suddenly felt bold. The consensus was brutal. The cultural shield was gone. For years, criticism carried risk. Writers hedged, hosts softened, networks hesitated. Now that hesitation had vanished. And when risk disappears, volume follows. People say more because they believe the consequences are minimal. Insiders say that realization, more than the jokes themselves, is what deeply unsettled Meghan. Not mockery, but permission. When comedians feel safe, it means audiences feel aligned. And once that alignment forms, reversing it doesn't come from messaging. It comes from absence, recalibration, and time. A lot of time. The most unsettling part? None of the jokes relied on new information. No scandals, no leaks, no revelations, just framing. And once framing sticks, it becomes the lens through which everything else is seen. By the end of the second day, the question wasn't, did they go too far? It was, why does this feel so familiar? It was, why did this feel inevitable? And inevitability is the enemy of reinvention because reinvention depends on surprise. Nothing about this felt surprising anymore. Insiders say the panic wasn't just about reputation, it was about trajectory. Once a public figure becomes a reliable punchline, they stop being aspirational and start being illustrative. Used to make points, used to signal fatigue, used to bond with audiences who feel talked at instead of talked with. Late-night hosts don't make that leap unless they're sure it's safe. As the dust from the monologues settled, one thing became clear. This wasn't a spike that would fade by the next news cycle. It was a reclassification, from protected figure to fair game, from delicate subject to open commentary, and once those shifts happen, they're almost impossible to reverse, because comedy doesn't just reflect culture. It declares where culture thinks it's safe to stand, and culture just took a step away. By the time the third phase set in, the story stopped behaving like a scandal and started acting like a reset. Not loud, not chaotic, just a slow, unmistakable recalibration of how power, sympathy, and relevance were being assigned. The jokes had landed, the audience had laughed, the industry had taken notes. What followed wasn't outrage, it was acceptance, and acceptance is far more dangerous than criticism. At that point, the damage no longer depended on what anyone said next. The narrative detached from her responses entirely. Defenders could argue intent, critics could argue fatigue, but the real shift lived in tone and memory, how easy the jokes felt, how little resistance there was in the room. Insiders describe this as the after-image moment, when punchlines echo even after the clips stop circulating. When writers and producers subconsciously factor in audience reaction before attaching a name to a project, not out of malice, but instinct. Nothing scares gatekeepers more than becoming the next punchline themselves. That's when the panic reportedly turned inward. Not angry calls, not public rebuttals, strategic silence, fewer appearances, fewer statements, no direct engagement because arguing with comedy only gives it more power. What unsettled Meghan's circle most wasn't hostility. It was indifference. The quiet from allies, the absence of outrage. Not because people turned against her, but because the moment no longer felt defensible in the same way. That's the real impact of the late-night shift. It wasn't cruelty, it was permission. Permission to disengage without guilt, to stop treating criticism as taboo, to move on emotionally without announcing it. And once that permission spreads, it doesn't get rescinded. The jokes didn't age out, they didn't need to. They fit too neatly into existing conversations. They felt less like a reaction and more like a summary, and summaries are hard to shake. In the days that followed, the temperature cooled, but not in her favor. Fewer debates, fewer defenders, more shrugs and scroll-bys. In celebrity culture, backlash means people still care. Apathy means they think they already understand the story. Insiders say the strategy flipped overnight, from damage control to long-term recalibration. Not image repair, but image subtraction. Pulling back instead of pushing forward, letting time do the heavy lifting instead of statements and spin. Because once a public figure becomes shorthand for a certain kind of fatigue, the only real reset is to stop feeding the cycle that keeps it alive. That's the irony in all of this. Nothing new was exposed, no scandal, no secret tape, no smoking gun. The explosion wasn't about facts, it was about framing finally catching up to public sentiment, and sentiment doesn't respond to rebuttals or clarifications, it responds to absence. Late-night comedy has always worked this way, quietly but decisively. It doesn't invent villains out of thin air. It senses when an audience is ready to stop protecting someone, when empathy thins, repetition dulls impact, and patience runs out. Then it steps in, not as an attacker, but as a translator of what people already feel. That's why this moment feels irreversible, not because recovery is impossible, but because recovery now requires a totally different playbook. Less explaining, less visibility, less insisting on being understood, more space, more patience, more willingness to let the narrative loosen on its own. The danger now is moving too fast. Trying to reclaim control too aggressively would only confirm the joke's premise that everything is being managed and framed. And once that suspicion sets in, even sincerity starts to feel like performance. That's the trap. What's left is a waiting game, waiting to see if absence cools the fatigue or deepens it. Waiting to see if future appearances feel refreshed or just recycled. Waiting to see if this becomes a footnote or the turning point. Because this is what late-night comedy does at full power. It doesn't cancel careers, it reclassifies them. From aspirational to observational, from protected to discussable, from untouchable to fair game. And once that shift happens, the burden changes. Not to defend, but to evolve in a way so natural that the jokes stop landing. That's the real aftermath. Not the laughter, but the silence that follows, when everyone quietly agrees they've heard enough and waits to see if anything truly new will ever be said.